Welcome to Cardio Insights, the podcast where we explore how digital solutions are transforming cardiovascular and emergency medicine. Featuring thought leaders from leading institutions across the globe, this series of conversations unveils the power behind clinical algorithms and decision support tools, and how they are changing the way we diagnose and manage cardiac conditions. From their impact on clinical practice, their benefits for patient outcomes, and the challenges they pose to health systems in terms of implementation and regulation, this podcast is intended as a precious resource for healthcare professionals in cardiology and emergency medicine who are curious to learn more about this exciting field. I'm your host, Matthew Chaffert, and you are listening to Cardio Insights. So welcome, Afua, to this episode of Cardio Insights, the podcast where we explore how digital solutions are transforming cardiovascular and emergency medicine. For our listeners who might be new to you, you are a Director of Health Policy and External Affairs at Roche Diagnostics, with a background in digital health, spanning philanthropy, academia, and the industry. So in this role, you are leading data and digital policy topics, liaising with external stakeholders to advocate for efficient data, AI, and digital legislation and policies to advance, ultimately, patient access to our digital health solutions. So in this episode, we want to explore with you the political and ethical implications around digital algorithms and clinical decision support tools in healthcare, but also the challenges and the potential pitfalls they bring. The goal for our listeners is to understand the role of policy and legislation in driving the adoption of these tools in clinical practice and the mechanisms at play. So as a first question for you to set, let's say, the tone for the topic we're going to discuss, can you explain us in general terms, what's the role of policy, health systems and governments in driving the digital transformation in healthcare?
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for having me. I guess this is quite a loaded question in asking what's the role. We're talking three separate entities here: policy, health systems, and governments. I think working policies are oftentimes set by governments to ensure that perhaps they've identified a need or they see the need to pursue a certain strategy, and so then they go through the whole legislative process to put a policy in place to enhance that. Now, policies within health systems are often broad. They could be more at the public health level, or they could be more targeted if, for instance, they're during the pandemic where a lot of resources were put to COVID-19. And so I guess maybe I could reframe the question to kind of say, what are the current health system challenges that our governments may find the need to use policies to enhance? So people are aging, and getting older, which means that they have a higher likelihood of getting non-communicable diseases, which includes heart disease. Exactly, cardiovascular diseases, and even the broad cardiometabolic set of diseases, which could include diabetes, among others. So this is also costing a lot of money then to take care of people. So health systems, the cost of care keeps going up. And so there are current discussions of finding new procurement measures, understanding ways to move care from hospitals to maybe a primary care setting or potentially the home, to save money. And also this is where a lot of digital tools are potentially being applied. Other challenges in the health systems, like we could go on and on, but this gives you a general sense of sort of the challenges the health systems are currently facing, and hence policies that are going along to address these challenges. So I'd say overall, to answer your question, governments stipulate policies to address challenges that arise in health systems, and these evolve over time, but I think currently some of the examples I just gave are the most prominent.
Are there certain mechanisms that are known in the, let's say, at a policy level to address some of the needs that you mentioned? Can you give us some examples that you've seen from your work and that are, let's say, standard in regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, exactly. So I do access policy. It's not quite regulatory policy. There's a bit of a divide. But I do work closely with our regulatory policy colleagues. So yes, there are some processes on the normal sort of policy aspect where I work. If there is, let's say, an issue, the government identifies an issue in the health system, for instance, several people are getting infectious diseases. Oftentimes they can mobilize a task force with certain public health experts, which could be a broad range from epidemiologists to physicians, and then they could then try to analyze the issue. And then on the policy side, perhaps organize some roundtables with various experts. It could be academics as well, could be involved, and then try to understand the problem. Once they get a grasp of what that problem is, then they proceed with identifying different solutions. And so you have these big agencies like perhaps the CDC, the European CDC, CDC in the US, the European CDC. They're often tasked with those public health type challenges. And I think that is most of the ways that the government tends to operate. Of course, there are Department of Health or Ministry of Health agencies that also have people that do this, but I think it really depends on the problem that they're trying to tackle, whether a task force or a roundtable with experts, and how urgent, right? During COVID, going through this process is not as efficient, and so you very quickly have to re-strategize and say, how can we be as quick and efficient as possible? And so if it's a public health issue, like non-communicable diseases, you can then be a bit slower relatively to an epidemic where you have to be quicker with your decisions. So I guess the method that the government would use would depend on how urgent or pressing the health system need is.
Understood. And I mentioned in the introduction that, one focus for, in general for our conversation in this podcast series is digital health solutions. So I think it's an established term, but it's a field from a technological perspective that progresses very fast. So the latest advances we've seen in artificial intelligence, we touched about that episode with Dr. Matthew Prime from Roche, with Professor Michael Gibson from Harvard in another episode as well. And I guess given the pace of progress, technologically speaking, I would see that or foresee that legislation is a bit like falling behind or trying to follow. And so I was wondering, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on how governments, health systems are trying to, let's say, adapt their local frameworks to enable these technologies or drive clinical adoption.
Yeah, very interesting question, because I think if you follow this sort of narrative at all, you would know that the EU is perhaps the most prolific in coming up with legislations around this space, right? So everything from the European health data space, which is more at the data level, right? Trying to ensure that there's a single, Europe has more use for its data in terms of primary use and secondary use, all the way to the AI Act, which is categorizing AI according to risk. So there are some banned uses of AI in the EU, and then there's high risk, low risk. Healthcare happens to fall into, most of the healthcare applications happen to fall into the high risk category. So, I mean, these legislations are being spurred by several, I think, observations within society to recognize that AI is really here to stay. It's making decisions for us. Actually, one of my favorite books is by Cathy O'Neill, which is called Weapons of Math Destruction. I particularly like the title. Exactly. I can highly recommend you to read it. And it goes beyond healthcare to explain how AI is being used in education, in social justice, in law, in all aspects of society. And this is actually an old book. And so I think the EU is leading the way, but even across the world, I think there has been an observation that the AI is here to stay, and it has been a big part of the legislations that are being, or perhaps recommendations. So the US has gone more on the route of recommendations. So the national NIST, the National Institute Standards and Technology released an AI risk management framework playbook recently, and then the Biden administration also released a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which set out a set of criteria for what should be highly recommended to be available in using AI systems. And so that's like in the sense of AI. Of course, data drives AI. We need data to be able to build AI tools, right, and train AI algorithms. And so that's where the other data legislations are crucial. And so the European Health Data Space, for instance, which is trying to get everyone on the continent that has data in scope to share the data and make data sets more comprehensive and available for training algorithms, as an example, I think is crucial to ensure that, we can build digital health tools, whether they incorporate AI or not. But I think the fundamental need for data is crucial. And that's also why I'm a big advocate of data governance mechanisms, because these need to be in place to ensure that you can at least have a bare minimum structure to your data to ensure that you can eventually utilize that data down the line.
Understood. One topic we've discussed, in some of the other episodes of the series, somewhere around, let's say, the utility or usability of these solutions from, let's say, a clinical perspective. So how can we, drive adoption from, clinicians for these tools? What are the requirements from a user experience perspective? And we also touched on the topic of reimbursement, notably with Dr. Matthew Prime that I mentioned earlier. And this is obviously a policy topic because it depends on, from what I understand, it depends on the willingness of health systems to fund certain types of these solutions, and which triggers, let's say, a broader access because it aligns incentives for notably healthcare professionals to use these tools. And so I would be, curious to understand how you see, when it comes to these digital algorithms or decision support tools, what's the current, let's say, situation from, health systems and sort of like attitude towards these solutions in terms of reimbursement or in terms of funding those?
Mm-hmm. That is $1 million question. I think, at Roche, we are building some of these clinical decision support tools. We have been working with various health systems to try to get them sort of adopted. And so we have firsthand experience of the challenges it takes to adopt these tools. We know that there is no broad understanding of what the concept of AI algorithm, what just even the term algorithm is. Not every physician perceives exactly, which goes a long way to determine their appetite to use it or not to use it. And so that's a bit of the adoption piece. Now, it costs a lot of resources, whether it's monetary or human resources, to actually get a CE mark or an FDA approved device or digital health tool, which is often a basic requirement for you to even attempt to get funding or reimbursement in several markets, right? And so for us, that's the underlying thing. We go through the process, but unfortunately, this regulatory process is completely dissociated from all the other aspects that will come along to enable it eventually adoption and reimbursement or funding. And I'm really emphasizing funding here because for some of the digital tools, reimbursement perhaps may not be the right way. It would have to tap into several budgets that sit within the health system. And so that's crucial here, I think. Also considering how long it takes to get a reimbursement code, for the most part, funding opportunities and innovative and alternative or creative funding opportunities is the best route for most of these tools. Now, once you have gotten the CE mark, you need to be able to prove that you're improving patient outcomes. You need to be able to prove that you're saving the health system, you're cost effective, so you're saving the health system some amount of money. And oftentimes you think of this process as it's traditionally a health technology assessment, right? I don't like to use the term health technology assessment because it gives the traditional meaning of what that term means. But what it actually should be is that I will call it value assessment framework, and what that should be is a framework that's fit for purpose with the digital solutions. So unfortunately, most of the current frameworks do not really capture the way that the digital solution will be built, which means that they're not fit for purpose to make those claims. And even most of the frameworks, if it's an app or solution that's targeting patients, then it's really easy to make that patient outcome link, which is often the benchmark that's used to say, yes, you are adding value to the system, right? Unfortunately, if you're making digital solutions that's targeting physicians, then the value assessment frameworks are usually not sufficient, right? Which means that you're not even eligible for funding or reimbursement because you can't solidify those claims. Of course, this is aside from all the other resources that's required to run a trial, and the fact that RCTs are not even fit for purpose. So, there's a whole host of problems that often comes with this. But just the fact that there are no value assessment frameworks that can capture the breadth and sort of depth of how AI or digital solutions that could be using AI and that are meant for physicians or public health individuals do not currently exist. It makes it extremely challenging to bring those types of solutions to the market.
Mm-hmm. I see. We talked about a lot of different subjects, and I'm keeping an eye on the time. There's a recurring question we asked all the guests on the show. Maybe for you it's a bit different because you're working on these policy topics. And the question was initially more tailored towards healthcare professionals or, let's say, people who develop these solutions. But I'll still ask it to you. So it's, if you had a magic wand, what type of digital solution would you like to see in healthcare? So maybe it touches on the data topic that you mentioned at the beginning.
Right. That's a really good question. I wouldn't say I'm completely naive to the development side of things, because I did do my PhD where I asked users what they would expect and created a checklist for app developers. And so perhaps I've dabbled in the user research. I wouldn't quite say fully, but a bit. I think we still have very siloed healthcare systems, which makes it difficult to integrate digital solutions. And I think the data, as you can tell, I'm passionate about that, needs to be interoperable. The data needs to be structured. The data needs to be of good quality. I think if we can have fit for purpose data governance mechanisms in place, and also have a high emphasis on comprehensive data sets, because one of the biggest challenges we have with algorithms is it's not often validated on the data that's used to validate it is not often applicable to the population that it's used in, which means that it's just not as effective. It's obvious I'm a Black woman, and if anyone's heard me talk, they've probably heard me say this. Most data sets do not include people like me. And this is also something that I'm passionate about very much, recognizing that I'm passively being subjected to algorithms that might not fully capture, or the breadth or diversity that is required to ensure that they can operate effectively. And so I think you're right. If I had a magic wand, I would ensure that we have comprehensive data sets. Of course, they're diverse in all sense of the word, but they're also structured, and there's a really great data governance process in place to ensure that once you're building these AI algorithms, that they're really going to work or be able to sort of fit the claims that we have. I think within the regulatory policy space, generative AI is still a big struggle. How do we regulate this? But that's all, it's happening now, but it's also like a buildup of everything else that's needed. But the fundamental thing, in my opinion, is data and getting it, structured and having good data governance structures in place, having comprehensive data to ensure that anything else that's built on top of it will be good for the citizens and for patients overall.
Yeah, would make the life of many easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much, Afua.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardio Insights. We hope you enjoyed it. If you want to dive further into other aspects of digital solutions in cardiovascular and emergency medicine, check out the other episodes of the series. To support the show, you could share this episode with your surroundings and leave a 5-star review on your preferred streaming platform. Cardio Insights is a podcast brought to you by Roche. Thank you for your time and see you in the next one.